She was a ghost long before she was a victim, a whisper in the sprawling, sun-dappled nightmare of the Queensland hinterland. This story doesn't begin with a body. It begins with a silence, a void where a vibrant young woman named Chloe Henderson used to be. At 24, Chloe was a free spirit, an artist who painted with wild, untamed strokes and preferred the company of the forest to that of the city. She lived in a small, weatherboard cottage on the edge of the Mapleton National Park, a place where the line between serene isolation and profound vulnerability was as thin as morning mist. Her friends described her as fiercely independent, with a laugh that could startle birds from the trees and a stubborn streak a mile wide. She was last seen alive on the afternoon of October 12th, buying supplies at the local general store: canvas, white spirits, and a bottle of cheap red wine. The shopkeeper, old Bill Grady, remembered her joking about finishing a new piece, a dark, abstract tangle of roots and branches she called the heart of the wood. He was the last person to see her. When Chloe failed to show up for her weekly shift at the Nambour Cafe 2 days later, a cold thread of unease began to weave through her small circle. It was unlike her. Her phone went straight to voicemail. The police, initially dismissive of another hippie girl taking off on an adventure, were slow to act. It was Chloe's mother, Margaret, who arrived from Brisbane, her face a mask of controlled panic, who truly ignited the investigation. She let herself into Chloe's cottage and found a scene of eerie tranquility. A half-finished cup of tea sat cold on the table. On the easel, the heart of the wood stared out, dark and unfinished. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry. It was as if the forest itself had reached in and plucked her out. The lead investigator, Detective Senior Sergeant Mark Ross, a man built like a brick wall with a face etched by decades of country tragedies, felt his first real prickle of dread. This wasn't a simple missing persons case. The silence was too complete. The investigation began to churn, a slow-moving beast waking from slumber. Ross and his team combed the dense rainforest around Chloe's property, their boots sinking into the damp leaf litter. They found nothing. Days turned into a week, then 2. The media, initially quiet, began to sniff the air. The term Hinterland Ripper was born not from the police but from a sensationalist headline in a Brisbane tabloid, a moniker that would soon cast a long and terrifying shadow. The break came not from a detective's deduction, but from a hiker's dog. A German shepherd, chasing a scent off a trail near Kondalilla Falls, returned to its owner with a mud-caked silver bangle in its mouth. It was a unique piece, a serpent coiled around a moonstone. Margaret Henderson identified it instantly. She had given it to Chloe for her 21st birthday. The search intensified, focusing on the treacherous gorges and waterfalls of the area. And then they found her, or rather, they found what was left of her. Chloe's body was discovered in a shallow creek bed, concealed beneath a cairn of moss-covered rocks. The scene was not just a murder, it was a composition. Her positioning was deliberate, almost ritualistic, and the injuries were of a brutality that made seasoned paramedics turn away. Ross stood over the scene, the humid air thick with the smell of decay and damp earth, and knew a predator was hunting in his district. The hunt was now a desperate race against an invisible clock. The autopsy report was a document of horrors, detailing a level of overkill that spoke of a deep, unfathomable rage. Forensics found minuscule paint particles under Chloe's fingernails, a specific, uncommon ultramarine blue not from her own palette. It was a whisper of a clue, a single thread in the dark. The police released a public appeal, and the town of Mapleton seemed to shrink in on itself, curtains twitching, doors locked before sundown. Then a second woman vanished. Sarah Chen, a university student on a weekend camping trip with friends. Her tent was found slashed open from the outside. The Ripper had struck again, and the stakes were now astronomical. Panic was a tangible force, a current in the very air. Ross assembled a dedicated task force, his own life subsumed by the case. the faces of Chloe and Sarah haunting his every waking moment. The break, when it came, was as bizarre as it was critical. A local mechanic servicing a 4WD for a man named Arthur Plemming noticed a deep, recent scratch along the passenger door and what looked like a smudge of the same rare blue paint. Plemming was a quiet man, a loner. He worked as a part-time gardener for the local council, a job that gave him intimate knowledge of the hidden tracks and forgotten corners of the hinterland. He was unremarkable, the kind of man you'd pass in the street and never remember. When detectives quietly pulled his record, they found a history of minor, strange offenses, peeping Tom incidents, trespassing, a portrait of a man who lived on the edges, watching. They brought him in for questioning. In the sterile, brightly lit interview room, Arthur Plemming was calm, polite. He explained the scratch on his car from a fallen branch, the blue paint from an old tin he'd used on a garden shed. He had an alibi for the night Sarah Chen disappeared. He was home alone, watching television. Ross watched him, the small, balding man with gentle eyes, and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. He was looking at the monster, but he had nothing to hold him on. The legal machine groaned into motion. Plemming's defense, led by a slick, cynical lawyer from the city, painted their client as a simple man, a victim of a witch hunt, a scapegoat for a terrified community. The prosecution's case, while compelling, was circumstantial. The paint match, the scratch on the car, his knowledge of the area, it was all suggestive, but not conclusive. The trial became a tense, grinding affair, a battle of forensics and expert testimony. The public gallery was packed every day, Margaret Henderson's stoic presence a silent accusation. For weeks it seemed the monster might simply walk back into the forest. And then, the climax. The prosecution called a surprise witness, Plemming's own wife, Eleanor. She was a faded, nervous woman who seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 silent fears. On the stand, she refused to look at her husband. The prosecutor approached her gently. "Mrs. Plemming," he said, his voice soft in the hushed courtroom. "Can you tell us what your husband said to you when he came home on the night of October 12th? She swallowed, her hands trembling. The courtroom leaned in, a single entity holding its breath. Arthur Plemming, for the first time, looked up from the table, his placid mask cracking for a single, terrifying instant. Eleanor Plemming took a shaky breath and spoke the words that would seal his fate. He said he'd been cleaning his brushes. He said, "The blue just won't come out." The ultramarine blue. The same blue found under Chloe Henderson's nails. The revelation was a thunderclap. It was the single, damning piece of evidence that connected him directly to the victim in her final, desperate moments. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty. Arthur Plemming, the Hinterland Ripper, was sentenced to life in prison, never to be released. He showed no emotion as the sentence was passed. In the end, the monster was not a mythic beast of the forest, but a quiet man with a paint-stained secret, a man who hid his darkness behind a facade of mundane normalcy until a single, careless sentence spoken in the supposed safety of his own home exposed the gruesome truth. He thought the forest would keep his secrets, but in the end, it was the silence of his own home that betrayed him. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.